You can't seriously think you deserve any part of Grandma's estate. Victoria's voice was sharp, cutting through the murmur of mourners departing the chapel. She stood in front of me, her arms crossed over her chest, eyes gleaming with contempt. I had expected this, some form of confrontation, some veiled insult, but hearing it spoken out loud, so openly, still stung. I gripped the edges of my black coat, my knuckles whitening as I willed myself to stay composed. She barely acknowledged you when she was alive, Victoria continued, a cruel smirk tugging at her lips. Let's not pretend she saw you as a real Evans. The scent of lilies, Grandma Margaret's favorite, hung thick in the air, mixing with the distant hum of voices as family members slowly trickled out of the small chapel. Rain pattered against the stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the marble floors. That's not fair, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the lump forming in my throat. Grandma never made that distinction. I was just as much a part of her life as you were. Victoria let out a short, humorless laugh, tilting her head slightly. Hopeful, aren't you? You were an afterthought. A nice addition, sure, but not real family. She smoothed her sleek black dress with manicured hands, the glint of her diamond ring catching the dim chapel light. The Evans legacy belongs to actual Evans blood. A cold weight settled in my chest, the same feeling I had carried for years, the quiet, aching awareness that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to belong, Victoria would always see me as an outsider. I forced myself to meet her gaze. I was Grandma Margaret's granddaughter for 27 years. That counts for something. It counts for nothing legally, she shot back, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She stepped closer, lowering her chin slightly as if speaking to a child. Look, I'm the only biological grandchild. Everything should come to me. If you fight this, you'll just embarrass yourself. The way she said it, so certain, so entitled, sent a flicker of anger through me. My name is Clara Evans, I said firmly. You don't get to decide what I deserve. Before she could respond, a voice interrupted us. Excuse me, Miss Evans. We both turned to see Mr. Callahan, the family lawyer, standing a few feet away. His gray hair was slightly damp from the rain, and he held a leather portfolio in one hand. I've scheduled a preliminary meeting about Margaret's estate for next week, he said, his tone even. I know this is a difficult time, but it's best to address these matters promptly. Victoria's smirk returned, slower this time, more deliberate. Wonderful, she said smoothly, shifting her posture to something more poised, more performative. We can settle this quickly then. As she turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something slipping from Mr. Callahan's portfolio. A sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. I quickly bent down and picked it up, my heart hammering. In the corner, written in ink that had faded slightly, were 6 simple words. To be opened only in the event of family dispute. My grandmother had anticipated this. I clutched the envelope tightly, my fingers trembling. A strange sense of certainty settled over me. Victoria's confidence might not be as unshakable as she thought. The day of the will reading arrived with a cold, overcast sky. The Evans estate loomed before me, its grand white columns standing stark against the dark clouds. This was my grandmother's home, the place where I had spent countless summers as a child. Now it felt unfamiliar, as though its warmth had died with her. I stepped inside, the air heavy with polished wood and old money. The study, where the meeting was set to take place, was just as I remembered. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with history books and leather-bound classics. The fireplace sat unlit, its marble mantel casting cold shadows across the room. Victoria was already there, lounging in one of the deep leather chairs, looking every bit the heiress she imagined herself to be. She wore a sleek black dress, legs crossed, a diamond bracelet glinting against her wrist as she scrolled through her phone. Clara, she said without looking up, her voice neutral, but her lips curled slightly at the corners. Didn't expect to see you here so soon. I thought you'd realize by now that this whole thing is pointless. I ignored her and took a seat on the opposite side of the room. Mr. Callahan, the family lawyer, arrived moments later, setting his briefcase down with a quiet click. He cleared his throat and opened a folder, adjusting his glasses before speaking. "Thank you both for being here," he began. "As you know, we are here to review the last will and testament of Margaret Evans. The estate includes the Evans family home, several investment accounts, and an extensive collection of rare historical letters, among other assets." I glanced at Victoria, whose expression remained composed, though her fingers tapped idly against the armrest of her chair. "Now, regarding the distribution of assets," Mr. Callahan continued, "Margaret Evans has divided the estate equally between her two grandchildren, Clara Evans and Victoria Evans." The words barely left his mouth before Victoria sat up straight, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "That can't be right." Mr. Callahan looked at her, unfazed. "The will is quite clear." Victoria let out a short, breathy laugh, shaking her head as though this was some kind of joke. "She wouldn't do that. Clara isn't even an actual Evans." She turned to me, her blue eyes flashing. "This is a mistake. You know that, don't you?" I met her gaze and held it. "No, Victoria, I don't." She scoffed, turning back to the lawyer. "This is absurd. My grandmother wouldn't leave our family heirlooms to someone who isn't even—" "Enough," Mr. Callahan interrupted, his voice steady. "I understand this may come as a surprise, but Margaret made her wishes very clear. The estate is to be divided equally between the two of you. If either of you choose to contest this, legal action can be pursued, but I must advise against it." Victoria clenched her jaw, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the armrest of her chair. "Then I will contest it," she spat. "She must have been manipulated. That's the only explanation." I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. "This isn't about the money," I said, keeping my voice measured. "It's about respecting Grandma's wishes." Victoria turned on me, her expression dark. Her real wishes would have been to keep the family legacy where it belongs. She leaned in, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You are the charity case our grandparents took in because your mother married into this family. You don't deserve a cent of what she built." The words cut deeper than I wanted them to. Before I could respond, my fingers brushed against the envelope still tucked inside my bag. The envelope. I had nearly forgotten about it in the chaos. I reached into my bag and pulled it out, feeling the weight of my grandmother's final words. Slowly, deliberately, I placed it on the table in front of me. Victoria's eyes flickered toward it, her brows furrowing. "What's that?" "A letter Grandma left for me," I said. I turned to Mr. Callahan. "She wrote that I should only open it in the event of a family dispute." For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely uneasy. Mr. Callahan adjusted his glasses, nodding. "Then perhaps now is the time to read it." I hesitated for a brief moment, then carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter and a small brass key. My pulse quickened as I unfolded the letter, my grandmother's elegant handwriting filling the page. "If Victoria questions your right to this family, then she too should question her own. The truth is in the study." My breath hitched. Victoria frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" I met her gaze, my heart pounding. "I guess we're about to find out." The study was just as I remembered. Dark wooden shelves stretching up to the ceiling, the scent of old books lingering in the air. The antique desk stood near the window, its drawers locked tight. It had always been Grandma's domain, a place where she kept records of family history, business dealings, and old letters she deemed too valuable to store anywhere else. Victoria stood beside me, arms crossed, her expression a mix of irritation and unease. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, shifting her weight. "Grandma was eccentric, sure, but she wouldn't have left anything important hidden away like some mystery novel." Ignoring her, I turned the small brass key in my fingers. It felt cold, heavier than it should have been. I crouched beside the desk and found the bottom drawer, the one that had always been locked. My grandmother had once told me, in passing, that some family truths aren't ready to be known until the right time. This was the time. The key slid into the lock smoothly, and with a click, the drawer opened. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. The edges of the papers inside were yellowed with age. Victoria stepped closer, trying to peer over my shoulder. Well, what is it? I opened the folder and began flipping through the contents. Birth certificates, adoption records, notarized statements, things that looked far older than I had expected. And then I saw it. A birth certificate. Victoria Ann Evans. I blinked, my eyes scanning down to the next line. Mother, Margaret Evans. Father, not listed. No, that couldn't be right. I flipped the page and found another document. A sealed adoption record. Victoria's name was listed, but the biological parents were two names I didn't recognize. My fingers trembled slightly as I skimmed further. More documents, all leading to one undeniable truth. Victoria wasn't born into this family. She had been adopted as a newborn. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Clara? Victoria's voice came from behind me, sharp with impatience. I turned to face her, gripping the folder in my hands. Victoria. I hesitated, measuring my words. You're adopted. Her face froze. For a long moment, she just stared at me, as if the words hadn't quite processed. Then, she let out a short, humorless laugh. What kind of joke is that? It's not a joke, I said quietly, turning the folder so she could see. It's all here. Grandma and Grandpa adopted you when you were a baby. They never told you. Victoria took a step forward, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to snatch the papers from my hands. That's not... She shook her head, her voice rising. That's not possible. Look at the documents. I laid them out on the desk, the yellowed papers spreading like shattered glass. Your birth certificate, the adoption records, everything. She reached out, hesitantly, her fingers brushing the edges of the paper. As her gaze ran over the words, her breath hitched. No. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. No, that's not true. It is. Silence stretched between us. For the first time in our lives, Victoria looked small. I had spent so many years resenting her, hating the way she had always weaponized our family name against me. And now, in an instant, everything had changed. Grandma never told you, I said softly, watching the emotions flicker across her face. Shock, anger, denial, grief. She never told anyone, but she knew this would come out one day. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. Her breathing turned shallow. Then, suddenly, she slammed her hands down on the desk. She lied to me, she spat, her voice cracking. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Everything she had ever believed about herself, her place in this family, her superiority over me, had just crumbled in an instant. You knew, she accused, turning on me, her blue eyes wild. You wanted to humiliate me. I shook my head. I didn't know, Victoria. But you did this to yourself. You've spent our whole lives telling me I wasn't a real Evans. But the truth is, neither were you. Her breath shuddered. She trailed off, shaking her head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then she lifted her chin, her jaw tightening. Her grief hardened into something colder. This changes nothing, she whispered, eyes burning. Nothing. I don't care what those papers say. I was the only grandchild that mattered. That hasn't changed. My stomach twisted. Even now, she was clinging to whatever scraps of power she had left. I met her gaze and spoke calmly. The courts might think differently. Victoria's hands trembled at her sides. This wasn't over, and we both knew it. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint scratching of pens on paper and the occasional whisper between attorneys. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled between two opponents before the final move. I sat at the long mahogany table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. Across from me, Victoria sat rigid, her face carefully composed, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the arms of her chair. Her lawyer, a sharp-looking man in an expensive navy suit, shuffled through a stack of papers before adjusting his tie. Judge Monroe, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses as she looked over the documents in front of her. She was the kind of judge who had seen it all: family betrayals, inheritance wars, old money disputes. This was just another case to her. "Let's begin," she said, her voice even. Victoria's lawyer stood first. He exhaled, then spoke with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, my client, Victoria Evans, is the sole biological grandchild of the late Margaret Evans," he said, casting a brief, pointed glance at me. "We contend that the estate should remain within the direct bloodline of the Evans family. While Clara Evans was included in the will, it is clear that she does not share the same rightful claim to the Evans legacy as my client does. The family heirlooms, assets, and properties should remain with the rightful heir, Victoria." I didn't react, keeping my expression unreadable. Victoria sat still, her head high, her perfectly styled blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She looked composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Mr. Callahan, my lawyer, rose to speak. He was older than Victoria's attorney, his graying hair neatly combed back, his suit impeccable but understated. He had been my grandmother's legal advisor for years. "Your Honor," he began, "we strongly oppose this challenge to the will. The late Margaret Evans explicitly divided her estate equally between both of her granddaughters. The claim that Victoria Evans is the sole rightful heir is entirely based on the assumption of biological lineage." He paused for emphasis, then added, "which we will now disprove." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victoria's jaw tensed, but she quickly regained her composure, keeping her eyes locked on the judge. Judge Monroe glanced over the rim of her glasses. "Mr. Callahan, explain." Callahan approached the bench, setting down a set of official documents: yellowed adoption papers, birth certificates, notarized affidavits. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "these documents prove that Victoria Evans was adopted as a newborn by Margaret and William Evans. She has no more biological connection to the Evans family than my client does." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. I heard a sharp inhale from Victoria, but she didn't say a word. Her lawyer, however, quickly stood. "Your Honor, we object to the introduction of these documents." "They are legally authenticated," Callahan interrupted. "Filed with the county, signed and notarized by both Margaret and William Evans. The truth is, neither of these women are biological heirs, but Margaret Evans chose to leave her estate to them both equally." I could see the color draining from Victoria's face. She clenched her jaw so tightly it looked painful. Judge Monroe flipped through the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. The weight of the truth settled over the room like a heavy fog. "So," she said slowly, looking at Victoria's lawyer, "your client's claim is that the Evans estate must remain within the biological bloodline. But this evidence shows that no such bloodline exists." Victoria's lawyer had no response. Judge Monroe let out a long sigh, tapping her gavel lightly against the desk. "Given the presented evidence, I see no legal grounds to contest the will. The estate shall remain divided equally, as Margaret Evans intended. Case dismissed." The final crack of the gavel echoed through the room. For the first time in my life, Victoria had nothing to say. The house felt different now. I walked through the front door of the Evans estate for the first time since the trial, the scent of old wood and faded perfume lingering in the air. Sunlight filtered through the grand windows, casting long shadows over the dark mahogany floors. It had once felt like Victoria's home, like I was merely a guest in a place that would never truly be mine. But now it belonged to both of us. I made my way to my grandmother's study, running my fingers over the antique desk where I had discovered the truth. The same desk where she had locked away secrets, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to find them. My fingers brushed against the edge of the chessboard she had kept in the corner of the room, the same one she had used to teach me when I was a child. "You think too much before you make your move, Clara," she had once said, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "Sometimes the best strategy is knowing when to let go." I had won the case. I had kept my place in the family. And yet, standing here now, I wasn't sure what winning even meant. I was halfway through packing up the study when I heard footsteps behind me. "Victoria." I turned to see her standing in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Her usual polished elegance was still there, the pristine black dress, the perfect blonde waves, but her eyes looked different. Less sharp, less certain. "You're really going through with it, then?" she asked. "Grandma wanted this place preserved," I said, closing a box of old letters. "I think it's worth honoring that," Victoria scoffed. "Spoken like a true Evans." I raised an eyebrow. I thought I wasn't a real Evans. For the first time, she didn't have a response. Instead, she walked further into the room, her gaze lingering on the chessboard. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and picked up one of the pieces, her fingers tracing over the polished wood. "She used to play with me too," she said quietly. I was surprised by the admission. "Did she ever tell you?" I asked. "That you were adopted?" A pause. Then a small shake of her head. "No. Never." I exhaled, watching as she turned the queen piece over in her hands. "Do you wish she had?" Victoria let out a dry laugh, setting the piece back down. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe. Maybe not." We stood there in silence for a moment, surrounded by the weight of our shared history. Finally, she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "You got what you wanted." I frowned. This was never about what I wanted. She held my gaze for a long time before speaking again. "I don't want the house," she said finally. "I never really did." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "So what happens now?" Victoria exhaled, stepping back toward the door. "I don't know. Maybe we stop fighting ghosts." I watched as she left, the sound of her heels fading down the hallway. Maybe that was the closest thing to peace we were ever going to get. A few weeks later, I sat in the study, flipping through my grandmother's old journal. Between the faded handwriting and the notes scribbled in the margins, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A letter tucked between the pages. I unfolded it carefully, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized her handwriting. "My dearest Clara," it read. "If you are reading this, it means you have learned the truth. About Victoria, about the family, about everything. I know it wasn't easy. Secrets never are. But I need you to understand something, my love. I never loved you less. You were never second to her, never less deserving. You were always my granddaughter in every way that mattered. I hope that, one day, Victoria will see that love does not come from a name, nor from blood, but from the choices we make. I chose you." Tears blurred my vision as I read those last 3 words. For years, I had fought for my place in this family, for my right to belong, but in the end, I had never needed to. I had already been chosen. I closed the letter, pressing my fingers against the ink as if I could somehow hold on to her words a little longer. Then, I set it back in its place. And finally, I let go.